All right, everybody, welcome back to the channel. It is Tuesday, October 21st, year of our Lord 2025. And today we are going to talk about how the fruit of the Spirit is not enough. That was a little over dramatic. I don't really mean that in that way. It sounds kind of sacrilegious to say, so I take it back. The fruit of the Spirit is enough. Yeah, that's right. But the thing is, it's not the whole story, and I think we all have to really come to terms with this. You know, there's a passage that I really like in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is my favorite book, which I say about every book. You know, every time we talk about another book in the Bible, I say it's my favorite book. They're all my favorite. There you go. But Ecclesiastes is very near and dear to my heart. I remember being a new believer, and at the time, you know, it's difficult sometimes to understand, I don't know, the prophets or things like that, where it's talking about these very high, you know, things that are, you know, you don't really have any experience thinking about, and they're difficult sometimes to understand. But the Ecclesiastes I always found was very practical, very down to earth, very much dealing with real life as it really is, which I appreciated. And in fact, I still appreciate that to this day. I enjoy talking more about things that are, you know, right in front of me as opposed to things that are, you know, high and kind of above me. Now, of course, you have to think about some of those things as well, but I'm just talking about my preferences and what I'm comfortable with. And there's a passage in Ecclesiastes that you probably haven't seen on a coffee mug or a t-shirt or a tattoo, or, I don't know, a poster or something like that. You're not going to go into Hobby Lobby and find this verse on anything. And it's chapter 7, verse 16, rather. And here's how it goes. You ready? Because these are the words of God. It says, "Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself?" Did you know that was in the Bible? Because it's in there. Do not be overly righteous. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Now, it's not a complete thought. Let me give you the extra stuff that makes it a complete thought, and I'll put it all together. Ready? Here's what it says. It says, do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. I find that to be very, very, very helpful. Very. Now, what is this saying, right? I would suggest maybe you spend some time thinking about this, meditating, if you will, if you want to use a spiritual sounding word. Meditate over this. Think about it. Pray about it. Because I think, especially in the Reform sort of online community of the people that are known and trusted, I think we really need to internalize what this is saying to us. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? I think there's a lot of people that are too smart for their own good. So smart that they become ineffective because of how smart they are. I see this in business a lot. You know, you hear people talking about paralysis by analysis, right? Where people think and they want to craft the perfect message. You know, in sales, for example, you want to craft the perfect email or the perfect cold call script, and you want to have it all buttoned up so it's just perfect, right? And you revise it and you edit it and you're tinkering all the time with it. And before you know it, a week has passed and you haven't made a single phone call. You haven't sent a single email. And you're paralyzed by this over-analysis when really what you need to do to be effective is to just do stuff, right? You just got to do stuff. Now, I'm not saying you don't think at all. You should think at all. But if you're going to go on one ditch or the other, where you're not thinking or thinking so much that you barely act, I would suggest not think and just act. And you probably will be more effective in sales. Now, this is the thing. Like, I saw Pulpit and Pen a long time ago talk about what they called wisdom signalers, right? Wisdom signalers. They're always signaling their wisdom and all of this kind of stuff. And I think it's the same kind of thing where you're so wise that you don't ever act on anything. You don't ever do anything. You just talk about wisdom all the time. And you just don't do anything. And there's a lot of people in Reformed Christianity that are like this, where they're so wise that they actually never do anything. You know what I mean? And I've been seeing a little bit of this. I saw Mike Winger. He's getting in on the Christian nationalism juice, you know? And he's very concerned about no enemies to the right and the tone of people and this and that. And we can't abandon the fruit of the Spirit in politics. I mean, what do you think? You know, and all this kind of stuff. And that's the thing about wisdom. There's some truth there, but you also have to act, right? And sometimes you might not be able to slice exactly how the fruit of the Spirit applies to, I don't know, let's just call it ICE, the ICE, mission and all this kind of stuff. You might not be able to do that, but you still have to do stuff as a politician, right? And when you're a politician, your only objective, your only real mission, your only purpose is to punish evildoers, terrorize evildoers, and promote what's good. And that's your mission. And you're going to end up doing things as a politician engaged in politics and promoting things that maybe you wouldn't promote with your own kids in your own family as a father, right? Because many politicians are also fathers. And many politicians are also churchmen. And in each of these roles, it's not like you cease becoming a Christian as a politician, right? No, you're still a Christian, but you're going to do things that you probably wouldn't do in other contexts, and it's still okay. We talked about this the other day, Christian soldier is going to do things and behave in ways that they would never behave at home, right? Now, are we saying we just set aside the fruit of the Spirit when you're a soldier? I don't think that's what we're saying. But we have to understand that you have to know what time it is. And I saw Andrew Walker talk about, we can't set aside Christian ethics just because of what time it is. It's never time to set aside Christian ethics. And according to wisdom, that's true. That's true. I'm not throwing shade at Andrew Walker. But knowing what time it is actually is critical to deciding what you do, what your actions are. Even if you have the fruit of the Spirit, what you're doing, depending on what time it is, might be a little bit harder to see how you're bearing fruit as a Christian. And so we can't decipher and teach the fruit of the Spirit in a way that like an idiot would, if like a stupid person would, without regard for what time it is, because you have to consider what time it is when you're talking about bearing fruit as a Christian. Because you don't bear the same fruit of the Spirit regardless of what time it is. That's just how it is. I'm sorry to say, this is real life. This is real life, and the Bible was written for real life. And the life of a Christian is a real life. I'm kind of confusing myself here, so hopefully I'm not confusing you. And so you have to consider what time it is. Here's Blake Callens. Now, this guy is not a serious person, right? He's not a serious person, so I even hesitate to even mention him, because he's a goofball. He's a cartoon character as far as I'm concerned. But Blake was picking up on something Andrew Walker was talking about. And again, I'm not throwing shade at Andrew Walker. This is what Blake says, and he's trying to criticize Andrew Walker, because this is Blake's strategy. Like, he sees anyone who's kind of breaking ranks a little bit, he sees them as a weak link, right? And so he tries to throw shade at other people, seeing an opportunity. So he saw an opportunity with Andrew Walker with what he said, and said, here's AD. Here's AD advocating for exactly what Andrew rightly condemns as, quote, severing Christian ethics from the practice of our politics with the excuse of, quote, what time it is. And what did I say? Here's what I said in regards to Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit. Don't apply the verse to life the way a fool does, without regard for what time it is. If you do, you're not actually applying the verse at all. So my premise is, if you forget about what time it is, then you're actually not applying the fruit of the Spirit properly. Because Fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control. All these things, right? They don't all apply equally to every situation. It's not peanut butter that you spread on every situation, no matter what the situation is. And we know this instinctually. That counts too, by the way. Instinctually, we know this. But also, we know this from the Bible. And let me give you an example that this is why it's critical to not pretend like you don't have to know what time it is. Being a Christian is the same in every situation, no matter what time it is. That's a way a fool would interpret the life of a Christian. That's stupid. And as a Christian, it's not a fruit of the Spirit to be stupid, right? Obviously. Don't be stupid. That's my message for you today. Don't be an idiot. And so you say, AD, what are you saying? Is there some times where you set aside the fruit of the Spirit? Well, riddle me this. We know from the Bible, and I affirm this as true, that the fruit of the Spirit is peace. That's one of the fruits of the Spirit. Peace. And so if you're bearing fruit as a believer, you should live a life of peace. Right? That should be something you desire. That should be something you practice. When you're at home with your children, it should be a peaceful home. It's the fruit of the Spirit. You can't argue with it, right? You simply can't. Now, here's the problem. We also know from the Bible that there is a time for peace and a time for war. And you have to deploy wisdom in order to, first of all, recognize what time it is. Very important. What time it is very important. And also to recognize how you're going to react in those situations, right? So when it's a time for peace, you should be acting in a peaceful way. You shouldn't be stirring things up when it's a time for peace, right? You shouldn't be looking for controversy and trying to put people against each other and fight and all this stuff when it's a time for peace. That would be bearing fruit of the Spirit. But when it's a time for war, what I'm telling you is when it's a time for war, to be at peace is inappropriate. That's not how a Christian should act when it's a time for war. When it's a time for war, I would argue that bearing fruit of the Spirit would require you to not act like a fool. You shouldn't be calling peace, peace when there is no peace. When there is no peace, it's time to fight. And to fail to fight when it's a time for war is to fail as a Christian. And it's not setting aside the fruit of the Spirit. It's understanding the fruit of the Spirit in its context. And not every situation calls for every single fruit of the Spirit to be shown and deployed and to be used and to practice at all times, right? See, so what I would argue is, of course, as a Christian politician or someone engaged in politics, voter or whatever it is, right? There's different things. You don't set aside the fruit of the Spirit, but sometimes one kind of overshadows the other, right? It's a time for war, and you're the king, or you're a soldier. Then you need to actually be leaning into faithfulness. Faithfulness, not gentleness. Faithfulness, not peace. Because sometimes there is no peace. And to pretend like there is peace when there's not peace, you're fooling yourself, and I would argue you're not being faithful. And so let's not be stupid about this. Let's not be stupid about this. No real Christian is out here saying, the fruit of the Spirit doesn't apply. No, what is said, though, is you can't just yell fruit of the Spirit and expect everyone to be saying, well, yeah, I guess fruit of the Spirit. I'm a Christian after all. And they're in the middle of a war and they just lay their weapons down. It's peacetime. And then they just get slaughtered and all this kind of stuff. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. And so when you're the famous example everybody uses, someone comes to hurt your wife and all this kind of stuff, and you kill the intruder, right? Maybe with a gun, maybe with a knife, maybe with your bare hands, right? Like a real beast. It doesn't do anyone any good to wisdom signal and to act like they're overly righteous. They're overly wise. How dare you do that as a Christian? How dare? That wasn't loving or kind or patient. You should have been patient with the intruder. You should have been patient with the rapist. All this stuff. That's not what time it is. You need to consider what time it is. Otherwise, you're turning the fruit of the Spirit into nonsense. And it's not nonsense. You're also turning the Bible against itself. There's a time for peace, and there's a time for war. There's a time for peace, and there's a time for war. And we have to do the work to grapple with, okay, there's fruit of the Spirit is peace. It doesn't say the fruit of the Spirit is war, but there's also a time for peace and a time for war. So what does that mean? How do I wrestle with that, And it's really not that complicated unless you're one of these that's trying to be overly wise or overly righteous. And in doing so, you will destroy yourself. You will destroy yourself to try to do the gymnastics required to really just deny reality, to deny how life really is. And so let's not be stupid about this. I mean, Blake is stupid. He's not that bright. Okay, so he's just is what he is, right? He's acting foolish because he's a fool, right? But don't let anyone, even if they're not a fool like Blake, whether it's Andrew Walker, I'm not saying he's doing this, but maybe he is, whether it's Mike Winger, all this kind of stuff, don't let them wisdom signal you into inaction. Don't let them think that you need to be overly righteous or overly wise, and in so doing, destroying yourself. There's a time for peace, and there's a time for war. There's a time for love, there's a time for hate, and you have to accept it. It is what it is. Fruit of the Spirit is love, but there's a time to hate. You have to accept it. I'm sorry, but you just have to. In any case, this is the thing. It makes life more complicated too, right? Like it is more difficult to accept reality as it really is. It's easier to pretend, at least for a time. But you just have to do the hard work. It's as simple as that. Hope you found this video helpful. God bless.